Grace Rivera's hands trembled as she held the sterilized tweezers inches from 8-year-old Ethan Wellington's ear. In the opulent silence of the 47-room mansion, what she was about to attempt defied everything logic dictated. 47 specialists, $50 million in treatments, Harvard-educated doctors, Yale-trained surgeons, specialists flown in from Switzerland and Japan, all had declared the same verdict: congenital deafness, permanent, irreversible. Yet here stood a $12 an hour housemaid, about to prove them all catastrophically wrong. The tiny fragment she glimpsed deep within Ethan's ear canal wasn't supposed to be there. Every instinct from her buried past as a pediatric nurse screamed that this child's silence wasn't God's design, it was man's oversight. One delicate movement, one precise extraction, and she would either restore a miracle or destroy what remained of her shattered life. The grandfather clock chimed noon. In 30 seconds, Ethan Wellington would hear it for the very first time. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. 6 months before that fateful day with the tweezers, the Wellington estate stood as a monument to both immense wealth and profound sorrow. Mark Wellington, at 45, commanded a technology empire worth $3.2 billion. Yet he would have traded every penny for 30 seconds of his son's laughter echoing through their 47-room Connecticut mansion. The boy in question, 8-year-old Ethan Wellington, moved through the estate's marble halls like a ghost. Born into silence, he communicated through graceful sign language and spoke volumes through his extraordinary artwork, canvas after canvas depicting sounds he could only imagine. Birds in flight with musical notes streaming from their wings. Children playing instruments surrounded by swirling colors representing melodies he'd never heard. Thunderclouds crackling with golden lightning he felt only as vibration. Ethan attended the most exclusive private academy for deaf children, where his intelligence shone brilliantly despite his perceived limitations. Yet something troubled those who observed him closely: a persistent habit of scratching behind his left ear, a detail dismissed by countless specialists as mere nervousness. Mark had consulted 47 of the world's most renowned specialists: Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, private physicians from Switzerland who charged $50,000 for consultations. Each delivered the same devastating verdict: congenital sensorineural hearing loss, permanent and irreversible. Mark had spent $50 million chasing impossible cures, driven by guilt that consumed him since his wife Catherine's death 3 years prior, a car accident that wasn't quite what it appeared. Into this world of desperate wealth and quiet suffering came Grace Rivera, 28 years old and recently hired as household staff. Grace worked 6 days a week for $12 an hour, every penny dedicated to supporting her 16-year-old sister Maria, who lived with Down syndrome. Grace's modest staff quarters, tucked away in the mansion's service wing, starkly contrasted with the family's opulent lifestyle. What Mark didn't know, what no one knew, was that Grace Rivera had once been a pediatric nurse at Boston Children's Hospital. 2 years ago, a tragic patient death had cost her both her medical license and her faith in herself. She'd fled to housekeeping work, determined never again to hold a child's life in her hands. Overseeing the household staff was Harrison Blake, 67 years old and devoted family butler for 20 years. Harrison had served since before Ethan's birth, witnessing every family tragedy with seemingly unwavering loyalty. Yet beneath his professional demeanor simmered a bitterness toward new money and carefully concealed plans that would soon unravel. Grace Rivera's first week at the Wellington estate revealed a household trapped in suffocating routine. Each morning brought the same ritualistic parade of specialists, therapists, and experimental treatments that had defined Ethan's young life. The boy endured these sessions with remarkable patience, his intelligent eyes reflecting a weariness that no 8-year-old should possess. Dr. Victoria Hartwell from Johns Hopkins had become the latest hope, arriving twice weekly with briefcases full of cutting-edge diagnostic equipment. Mark hung on her every word as she discussed revolutionary gene therapy approaches costing upwards of $2 million. We're exploring completely uncharted territory, Dr. Hartwell explained during one session Grace witnessed. If successful, This could rewrite everything we understand about congenital hearing loss. But Grace found herself watching Ethan rather than the doctors. During his Tuesday art therapy session, she noticed something peculiar, a specific pattern to his movements. Every few minutes, Ethan would pause his painting to scratch behind his left ear. Always the left ear. Always after spending extended time in his bedroom. The scratching wasn't random or anxious. It followed a deliberate rhythm, as if something inside was irritating him. The observation triggered a distant memory. Grace's younger brother Miguel had exhibited identical behavior years ago during their childhood in Boston. Their mother, unable to afford specialists, had discovered the cause herself: dust mites in Miguel's bedroom carpet causing chronic allergic reactions in his ear canal. The scratching had stopped completely once they removed the offending carpet. Grace's medical training, dormant but never forgotten, began stirring to life. She found herself studying Ethan's movements, noting the correlation between his scratching and specific environmental factors. The behavior intensified after nap time in his room. It decreased dramatically when he spent afternoons in the garden or library. 3 weeks into her employment, Grace gathered enough courage to approach Mark during his evening review of medical reports. She found him in his study, surrounded by towers of specialist evaluations and experimental treatment proposals. "Mr. Wellington," Grace began hesitantly, "I've noticed something about Ethan that might be important." Mark barely looked up from Dr. Hartwell's latest genetic analysis. "I'm sure the doctors have considered every possibility. Grace, we've consulted 47 specialists." "Yes, sir, but I've observed that Ethan scratches his left ear primarily after spending time in his bedroom. It might indicate an environmental factor." "Environmental factor?" Mark's tone sharpened with irritation. "Grace, we've had the finest pediatric specialists in the world examine my son. Harvard-educated doctors, Yale-trained surgeons. Do you honestly believe they've overlooked something as simple as room allergens?" Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but her medical instincts refused to retreat. Sometimes the most obvious explanations are the easiest to miss, especially when everyone's looking for complex answers. Mark set down his papers with deliberate patience. "I appreciate your concern, but please leave medical observations to the professionals. Your job is housekeeping, not diagnosis." From the doorway, Harrison Blake cleared his throat softly. Perhaps Grace should focus on her assigned duties rather than areas beyond her expertise, the butler suggested with polite firmness. "Master Ethan has the finest medical care money can provide." Grace nodded mutely and retreated, but Harrison's subtle discouragement only strengthened her conviction. Something wasn't right, and it went beyond medical mysteries. Meanwhile, Ethan was developing his own relationship with Grace that transcended the typical employer-staff dynamic. Unlike other household employees who spoke to him with exaggerated gestures and pitying expressions, Grace communicated naturally. She'd learned basic sign language within her first month, surprising Ethan with her quick comprehension and genuine interest in his artistic expressions. During their afternoon conversations in the garden, Ethan shared his artwork depicting imagined sounds. One painting showed a thunderstorm as cascading purple ribbons. Another depicted his father's voice as warm golden streams. Most poignant was his representation of laughter, something he'd never heard but imagined as dancing butterflies in rainbow colors. "Do you think birds sing in colors?" Ethan signed to Grace one afternoon as they walked through the estate's rose garden. Grace smiled, her hands moving gracefully in response. "I think they sing however your heart imagines them. Your paintings show me sounds I never noticed before." These moments created a bond that didn't go unnoticed by Harrison Blake, who observed their growing friendship with increasing unease. The butler had invested too many years in carefully orchestrated plans to allow a housemaid's meddling to disrupt everything now. As Grace tucked away her suspicions about Ethan's condition, she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was missing something fundamental. The child's intelligence, his responsive nature, his obvious frustration during medical examinations, none of it aligned with permanent congenital deafness. But challenging 47 specialists would require courage Grace wasn't certain she possessed. 2 months into her employment, Grace Rivera found herself conducting covert investigations that would have shocked her employers. During the quiet hours after midnight, when the Wellington mansion settled into peaceful darkness, Grace slipped into Ethan's bedroom with a small flashlight and her reawakened medical instincts. The room was a masterpiece of wealth and thoughtful design, custom furniture crafted from Brazilian mahogany, hand-painted murals depicting peaceful forest scenes, and toys that cost more than Grace earned in 6 months. But what captured her attention was the floor covering an exquisite Persian-style carpet installed just 6 months before her arrival. Grace knelt beside the carpet, running her fingers through its luxurious fibers. Her medical training, dormant for 2 years but never truly forgotten, kicked into high gear. The carpet's texture felt unusually synthetic despite its expensive appearance. She carefully collected several fiber samples, noting their protein-rich composition that could easily trigger allergic reactions in sensitive individuals. Her nighttime research revealed something troubling. The carpet had been special ordered by Harrison Blake himself. Despite Mark's preference for hardwood floors throughout the house, Harrison had insisted that Ethan needed something soft for his frequent falls, a justification that made little sense for a perfectly coordinated 8-year-old. But Grace's most shocking discovery came through an accidental encounter with Mark's private study. While cleaning late one evening, she discovered a leather-bound journal hidden behind Catherine Wellington's portrait. The diary belonged to Mark's deceased wife, and its final entries painted a devastating picture of a woman consumed by guilt and self-hatred. March 15th. I cannot look at Ethan without seeing my own failure. How can I love a child who will never hear my voice? Never call me mama the way other children do. I am a terrible mother for thinking such thoughts. March 22nd. Mark spends fortunes on specialists while I feel nothing but resentment toward our broken son. What kind of monster am I? Perhaps Ethan would be better off without a mother who cannot truly accept him. April 3rd. Harrison understands my pain. He says Catherine's accident might be a mercy for everyone. The guilt is eating me alive. I cannot continue living this lie of loving a child I cannot accept. Grace's hands trembled as she read the final entry, dated just 2 days before Catherine's fatal car accident. The woman's death hadn't been a tragic accident. It had been a desperate escape from unbearable guilt. Mark had been living with the devastating truth that his wife chose death over accepting their son's perceived disability. More disturbing were Harrison's frequent mentions throughout the diary entries. The butler had been feeding Catherine's self-doubt, encouraging her darkest thoughts about Ethan's condition. Harrison had positioned himself as Catherine's confidant while systematically undermining her maternal instincts. Grace's investigation into Harrison's background revealed an even more sinister truth. Through careful examination of household financial records, she discovered that Harrison stood to inherit a substantial sum if Ethan was declared permanently disabled. Mark's will, written in grief after Catherine's death, included a clause leaving $100 million to charity if Ethan could not assume control of the Wellington Industries legacy due to permanent disability. Harrison had orchestrated a 20-year plan of subtle sabotage. The expensive carpet with its allergen-rich fibers was just the latest move in a campaign designed to worsen Ethan's condition. Harrison had been gradually introducing environmental toxins that would maintain and intensify the child's hearing problems. But Harrison's manipulation extended beyond environmental factors. Grace discovered that the butler had influenced Mark's choice of specialists, steering him toward doctors who favored surgical interventions over environmental assessments. Harrison had even arranged for certain test results to be delayed or misinterpreted, ensuring that simple solutions would remain hidden. The revelation forced Grace to confront her own devastating past. 2 years ago, she had been Dr. Grace Rivera, a respected pediatric nurse at Boston Children's Hospital. Her downfall came when a 2-year-old patient died under her care, a death that an investigation later revealed could have been prevented with earlier intervention. The child, Emma Martinez, had presented with symptoms that Grace initially diagnosed as a common respiratory infection. But Grace's hesitation to challenge the attending physician's treatment plan resulted in a delayed diagnosis of pneumonia. Emma died 3 days later. and Grace's medical license was revoked for failure to advocate adequately for her patient. The parallels between Emma's case and Ethan's situation were haunting. Once again, Grace faced a child whose life hung in the balance. Once again, medical professionals were missing obvious environmental factors. Once again, Grace's speaking up could mean the difference between life and permanent disability. But this time, the stakes involved more than medical ethics. Grace's investigation of Ethan's condition meant risking exposure of her medical background. If Mark discovered that he had unknowingly hired a disgraced nurse, Grace would lose her job immediately. More devastating, her sister Maria would lose the specialized care that Grace's income provided. The moral dilemma kept Grace awake through countless nights. She possessed the knowledge to help Ethan, but using that knowledge would expose her true identity and past failures. Harrison Blake continued his subtle campaign to discredit Grace's observations, spreading whispers among the household staff about her inappropriate attachment to the Wellington family. Grace realized that Harrison was aware of her investigation. The butler's knowing glances and veiled threats suggested that he had discovered her medical background and was prepared to use it against her. Harrison held all the cards: 20 years of faithful service versus a maid with a hidden past and dangerous knowledge. As Grace stared at the fiber samples she had collected, she faced an impossible choice: remain silent and watch Ethan suffer under Harrison's manipulation, or risk everything by challenging 47 specialists and a family butler who had successfully concealed his sinister agenda for 2 decades. During the 3rd and 4th months of Grace's employment, the Wellington estate became a battlefield of hidden agendas and mounting tensions. Grace began systematically documenting Ethan's symptoms with the precision of her former medical training, creating detailed charts that tracked his ear-scratching patterns against environmental variables. Every observation confirmed her growing certainty the child's hearing problems were environmental, not congenital. Working in secret during her off hours, Grace used basic chemistry knowledge acquired during nursing school to analyze the carpet fiber samples she had collected. Using household chemicals and simple pH testing strips purchased with her own meager wages, she identified protein compounds known to cause chronic allergic inflammation in ear canals. The evidence was mounting, but Grace knew that her amateur testing methods would never convince skeptical medical professionals. Meanwhile, Mark's desperation reached new heights as Dr. Victoria Hartwell presented an experimental gene therapy proposal that promised to revolutionize treatment of congenital hearing loss. The procedure would cost $2.3 million and require Ethan to undergo invasive surgery followed by months of experimental treatments with unknown side effects. "This is our chance to make medical history," Dr. Tarani Hartwell explained during a family consultation that Grace overheard while cleaning the adjacent hallway. Ethan could be the first child to benefit from revolutionary genetic intervention. The publicity alone would advance our research by decades. Mark's board of directors at Wellington Industries had begun questioning their CEO's judgment and focus. Company shareholders expressed concerns about Mark's obsession with his son's condition affecting business decisions. The story had leaked to financial media, with headlines like, "Billionaire's Crusade When Personal Tragedy Impacts Corporate Leadership." The negative publicity created additional pressure for Mark to either solve Ethan's problem definitively or step back from his medical quest. The experimental gene therapy seemed like the dramatic solution that would vindicate his years of expensive medical consultations. During this period, Grace and Ethan's relationship deepened beyond typical employer-staff boundaries. Grace had mastered advanced sign language through online courses and library books, enabling complex conversations that revealed Ethan's extraordinary emotional intelligence and artistic vision. Their afternoon sessions in the garden had become the highlight of both their days. Ethan shared increasingly personal artwork with Grace, drawings of sounds he dreamed about experiencing. One particularly moving piece depicted his father's voice as warm golden ribbons wrapping around a small figure. Another showed children's laughter as cascading silver bells floating through a playground. Most heartbreaking was his representation of silence, a child standing alone in a completely white room, reaching toward colorful sounds visible through a window but unable to touch them. "I draw sounds because maybe if I can see them clearly enough, I'll be able to hear them someday," Ethan signed to Grace during one of their art sessions. Grace found herself teaching Ethan about sound waves using simple demonstrations with water ripples and garden fountains. She showed him how vibrations created patterns, helping him understand the physics of sound without revealing her medical knowledge. These teaching moments strengthened Ethan's attachment to Grace, who treated him as an intelligent child rather than a disabled patient. Harrison Blake observed this growing bond with increasing alarm. His carefully orchestrated 20-year plan was threatened by a housemaid's meddling, prompting him to intensify his sabotage efforts. Under the guise of routine carpet maintenance, Harrison arranged weekly deep cleaning sessions that reintroduced allergen-rich compounds into Ethan's bedroom environment. Harrison also launched a subtle campaign to undermine Grace's credibility among household staff and family friends. He spread rumors about Grace's inappropriate emotional attachment to Ethan, suggesting that her observations came from misguided maternal instincts rather than legitimate concerns. During staff meetings, Harrison questioned Grace's motivations and warned other employees against encouraging her amateur medical theories. The butler's influence extended to Mark's medical decisions. When Grace's environmental concerns were mentioned in household conversations, Harrison skillfully redirected discussions toward Dr. Hartwell's prestigious credentials and cutting-edge research. Harrison consistently promoted surgical and pharmaceutical interventions over environmental assessments, knowing that complex treatments would maintain Ethan's disability longer. Community judgment began weighing heavily against Grace. Other household employees, influenced by Harrison's whispers, started questioning Grace's methods and motivations. The estate's gardener complained that Grace spent too much time playing doctor instead of focusing on housekeeping duties. The cook suggested that Grace was overstepping boundaries with the Wellington family. Dr. Hartwell herself dismissed Grace's environmental observations during a consultation when Mark briefly mentioned the housemaid's concerns. Amateur observations often focus on coincidental patterns, the specialist explained condescendingly. Families desperately want simple explanations for complex medical conditions, but congenital hearing loss cannot be cured by removing carpets or changing cleaning products. Local high society circles buzzed with gossip about Mark's judgment in allowing household staff to influence medical decisions. At a charity gala, Grace overheard wealthy acquaintances questioning Mark's mental state and suggesting that grief over Catherine's death had compromised his parental judgment. Grace found herself increasingly isolated, with Ethan as her only ally. The 8-year-old had begun following Grace around the estate, preferring her company to that of his expensive specialists and tutors. This obvious preference created additional ammunition for Harrison's whisper campaign about Grace's inappropriate influence. The crisis reached a personal breaking point when Grace received devastating news about her sister Maria. The 16-year-old with Down syndrome was facing a serious health crisis requiring specialized surgery and extended rehabilitation. The medical expenses would cost $50,000, money Grace could never afford on her housekeeping wages. In a moment that revealed his true character, Harrison approached Grace with a solution wrapped in threat. He offered her $50,000 in cash to quit her position immediately and sign a confidentiality agreement preventing her from discussing Ethan's medical condition with anyone. "Your sister needs expensive care that your current wages cannot provide," Harrison said with false sympathy. "This generous offer would solve your financial problems while allowing the Wellington family to pursue appropriate medical treatment without interference." The offer forced Grace to confront an impossible moral choice. Taking Harrison's money would save Maria's life and ensure her sister's continued care. Refusing meant watching Maria suffer while Grace pursued a medical theory that might be wrong. Every rational consideration pointed toward accepting Harrison's proposal and walking away from the Wellington family's problems. But as Grace watched Ethan painting another picture of imagined sounds, this one showing birds singing in colors only he could envision, she realized that some choices transcended rational calculation. The child's trust and the possibility of restoring his hearing had become more important than her own financial security. Grace Rivera, former pediatric nurse and current housemaid, prepared to risk everything on one desperate gamble that would either vindicate her medical instincts or destroy both their lives forever. Month 5 brought Mark Wellington to his breaking point, standing in his study surrounded by medical reports and financial statements documenting $50 million in failed treatments. He delivered an ultimatum that would forever alter their lives. Dr. Hartwell's experimental gene therapy represented the final frontier: either accept the $2.3 million procedure with its unknown risks, or abandon hope entirely. "We're out of options," Mark announced during a family meeting that included only himself, Ethan, and the hovering presence of Harrison Blake. Dr. Hartwell believes this experimental treatment could restore Ethan's hearing completely, but we must decide within 48 hours. The surgical window is extremely narrow. Grace, polishing silver in the adjacent dining room, overheard every word. The gene therapy involved invasive brain surgery followed by experimental treatments that could damage Ethan's cognitive development. The procedure had never been attempted on a child, and Dr. Hartwell's research data came from laboratory animals with mixed results. That evening, as Mark departed for an emergency business trip to salvage Wellington Industries' plummeting stock prices, Grace made her decision. She would risk everything on her medical training and environmental theory. If she was wrong, she could permanently damage Ethan's ear canal. If she was right, she could restore his hearing without dangerous experimental surgery. Grace spent the night preparing with methodical precision. She sterilized a pair of precision tweezers using hospital-grade disinfectant purchased with her own money. She studied ear anatomy diagrams borrowed from the local library, refreshing knowledge from her nursing school training. She reviewed proper extraction techniques for foreign objects in pediatric ear canals. The following morning presented perfect opportunity. Mark was away until evening. Harrison had departed for his monthly banking appointment, something Grace had observed during her months of careful observation. The household staff had been given the day off for a local holiday. Grace and Ethan would be completely alone in the 47-room mansion. "Ethan," Grace signed to the boy as he painted in the morning sunlight streaming through his bedroom windows. "I want to examine your ears. I think something inside might be making them uncomfortable." The 8-year-old studied Grace's face with remarkable intuition. Perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment, he set down his paintbrush and nodded solemnly. "Will it hurt?" he signed back. "I'll be very gentle," Grace promised, her hands trembling slightly as she positioned the sterilized tweezers. "Trust me, sweetheart. I want to help you hear the sounds you paint so beautifully." Grace's medical training took over as she carefully positioned Ethan on his bedroom carpet, the same carpet she suspected of causing his problems. Using a small flashlight to illuminate his ear canal, she could see what 47 specialists had somehow missed: an accumulation of infected, peeling skin caused by chronic allergic reaction to the carpet's protein fibers. The extraction process required delicate precision that Grace had performed hundreds of times during her nursing career. She worked slowly, removing layers of debris and infected tissue that had been blocking Ethan's ear canal for months. The child remained perfectly still, trusting Grace completely despite the obvious discomfort. "Almost finished," Grace whispered, though Ethan couldn't hear her words. She removed the final piece, a thick accumulation of infected skin that had created a complete barrier in his ear canal. The transformation happened instantly. Ethan's eyes flew wide open as the grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway chimed noon. For the first time in his 8 years of life, he heard sound, not the vibration he felt through his bones, but actual auditory sensation traveling through his restored ear canal to his brain. The boy gasped, then began crying, not from pain, but from overwhelming sensory shock. He heard his own breathing, his heartbeat, the rustle of fabric as Grace moved beside him. Every sound was a miracle, a revelation, a door opening into a world he had only imagined through his artwork. "Grace," Ethan whispered, his first spoken word in years coming out as barely audible breath. Then louder, with growing confidence and amazement. "Grace, I can hear you. I can hear everything." Grace burst into tears of vindication and relief. Years of medical training, months of environmental investigation, and one desperate gamble had proven correct. Ethan's deafness had been environmental, not congenital exactly as her nursing instincts had suggested. For the next hour, Grace and Ethan explored his restored hearing together. They listened to birds singing outside his windows, sounds that matched the colorful ribbons in his paintings with startling accuracy. They played music on his bedroom stereo, watching Ethan's face light up as he experienced melodies that aligned perfectly with his artistic visions. "Your paintings were exactly right," Grace told him as classical music filled the room. "You somehow knew how music would sound even though you'd never heard it." Mark returned from his business trip that evening to find his son sitting at the piano, pressing keys and laughing with pure joy at each note. The sight stopped Mark cold in his mansion's marble entryway. For several minutes, he simply watched in disbelief as Ethan experimented with sounds, calling out words, singing fragments of melodies, creating noise just for the wonder of hearing his own voice. "Grace," Mark whispered when she approached with the extracted debris carefully preserved in a medical container. "What did you do?" Grace showed Mark the infected tissue and skin fragments she had removed. It was never congenital deafness. Mr. Wellington. Ethan had chronic allergic reactions blocking his ear canals. The carpet in his bedroom contains protein fibers that caused ongoing inflammation and infection. Mark's emotional breakdown was complete and overwhelming. He fell to his knees beside Grace, sobbing with relief, guilt, and gratitude. $50 million spent on specialists who had never performed a simple environmental assessment. Years of his son's isolation caused by a carpet that could have been removed at any time. "How did you know?" Mark asked through his tears. "I'm a pediatric nurse," Grace confessed. "Or I was, until I lost my license 2 years ago. I recognized the symptoms because my brother had similar reactions as a child." Mark's gratitude overwhelmed any concern about Grace's hidden medical background. She had accomplished what 47 specialists couldn't. She had given him back his son's hearing through observation, dedication, and courage. But Harrison Blake's return that evening shattered their celebration. The butler discovered the family's joy and immediately realized that his 20-year plan had been demolished by a housemaid's intervention. In desperation, Harrison began making phone calls to medical authorities, reporting Grace for practicing medicine without a license and endangering a child through unauthorized procedures. "You've destroyed this family," Harrison told Grace privately as Mark celebrated with Ethan upstairs. "I'll see you in prison for what you've done. Medical boards don't tolerate unlicensed practice, regardless of the outcome." Grace faced her triumph with growing dread. She had restored Ethan's hearing, but Harrison's threats promised legal consequences that could destroy both their lives. The butler's 20 years of loyalty versus a housemaid's medical miracle would soon play out in courts where outcomes depended on credentials rather than results. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking exactly 12 hours since Ethan first heard its sound. Grace realized that her greatest professional achievement might also become her final act of medical practice before facing criminal charges that could separate her permanently from both Ethan and her disabled sister Maria. Within 72 hours of Ethan's miraculous hearing restoration, Grace Rivera's world collapsed with devastating swiftness. Harrison Blake's phone calls to medical authorities triggered an investigation that transformed Grace's greatest triumph into her darkest nightmare. The Connecticut Medical Board launched an immediate inquiry into unlicensed medical practice, while state prosecutors prepared criminal charges that could result in 5 years' imprisonment. The story exploded across national media, with sensational headlines that reduced Grace's careful medical intervention to tabloid fodder. "Miracle or crime housemaid performed surgery on billionaire's son." "Vigilante medicine when desperation trumps medical ethics." "The $12 cure that baffled million-dollar doctors." Television networks camped outside the Wellington estate, transforming the family's private triumph into a public spectacle. Grace was arrested on Thursday morning as she prepared Ethan's breakfast. Connecticut State Police arrived with warrants charging her with practicing medicine without a license, performing unauthorized medical procedures on a minor, and child endangerment. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists as Ethan watched in horror from the kitchen doorway, his newly restored hearing allowing him to understand every word of the charges against the woman who had saved him. The bail hearing set Grace's freedom at $100,000, a sum that represented 8 years of her housekeeping wages. She sat in the county jail's holding cell, wearing an orange jumpsuit and facing the reality that her sister Maria would soon be placed in institutional care. Without Grace's income and supervision, the 16-year-old with Down syndrome had no family support system. Media coverage painted Grace as either a heroic figure who succeeded where expensive specialists failed, or a dangerous amateur whose lucky outcome masked reckless endangerment. Conservative medical commentators condemned vigilante medicine that threatened professional standards. Progressive advocates praised Grace's courage in challenging medical establishment prejudices. The polarized coverage turned Grace's case into a national referendum on healthcare accessibility and professional gatekeeping. Mark Wellington faced an impossible choice between loyalty to Grace and protecting his family's reputation. His corporate attorneys advised immediate distancing from the scandal to protect Wellington Industries from ongoing damage. Company stock had dropped 12% since news broke, with shareholders demanding Mark's resignation if the controversy continued affecting business operations. The elite social circles that had previously welcomed the Wellington family now whispered about Mark's poor judgment in allowing household staff to influence medical decisions, and invitations to charity galas disappeared. Private school administrators questioned whether Ethan's continued enrollment might create unwanted publicity. Mark found himself choosing between supporting Grace and maintaining his son's social stability. Dr. Victoria Hartwell emerged as the medical establishment's most vocal critic of Grace's actions. During televised interviews, the Johns Hopkins specialist condemned dangerous precedents that could encourage unqualified individuals to attempt medical procedures. This case threatens the fundamental principles of medical safety, Dr. Hartwell declared. Lucky outcomes don't justify reckless endangerment of children. The prosecution assembled an impressive array of expert witnesses to testify against Grace's intervention. 47 specialists who had previously treated Ethan lined up to condemn her amateur diagnosis and dangerous extraction procedure. Each expert emphasized that Grace's lack of formal training could have resulted in permanent damage to Ethan's ear canal, regardless of the successful outcome. Grace's tragic past resurfaced during pre-trial hearings when prosecutors revealed her lost medical license and the patient death that ended her nursing career. Emma Martinez's death became evidence of Grace's pattern of medical recklessness that had culminated in unauthorized surgery on Ethan Wellington. The prosecution argued that Grace's past failures demonstrated a dangerous willingness to exceed professional boundaries. Harrison Blake proved to be the prosecution's most devastating witness. The butler testified about Grace's obsessive behavior and inappropriate emotional attachment to the Wellington family. Harrison portrayed himself as a loyal employee, trying to protect the family from Grace's increasingly erratic conduct. He described finding Grace in Ethan's bedroom during nighttime hours, collecting carpet samples, and making wild claims about environmental causes for the boy's deafness. Behind the scenes, Harrison planted additional evidence to support his testimony. He provided prosecutors with documentation suggesting Grace had been researching medical procedures online and purchasing surgical supplies with her own money. Harrison's fabricated timeline painted Grace as an unstable individual who had been planning unauthorized medical intervention for months. The case established a crucial legal precedent that could either legitimize emergency medical intervention by qualified individuals or open floodgates for dangerous amateur medicine. Legal experts debated whether Grace's successful outcome justified her methods, with implications extending far beyond her individual case. Public opinion remained sharply divided. Supporters organized Justice for Grace rallies, raising money for her legal defense and highlighting healthcare system failures that forced desperate families toward alternative solutions. Critics argued that accepting Grace's actions would encourage dangerous vigilante medicine that could result in countless injuries. Grace's breaking point came during a jailhouse visit from her court-appointed attorney, who delivered devastating news about Maria's deteriorating condition. Without Grace's support, Maria had been placed in a state facility where her Down syndrome needs weren't properly addressed. The 16-year-old was declining rapidly, confused by Grace's sudden disappearance and unable to understand the legal complexities keeping them apart. "Your sister asks for you every day," the attorney reported. "She doesn't understand why you can't come home. The facility staff says she's stopped eating and barely responds to therapeutic activities." Ethan's psychological trauma added another layer to Grace's guilt. Despite his restored hearing, the boy had withdrawn dramatically since Grace's arrest. He refused to speak, stopped painting, and spent hours staring silently out his bedroom windows. Mark's attempts to explain the legal situation only deepened Ethan's confusion about why the person who helped him was being punished. The darkest irony was that Grace's medical success had become the foundation for her legal destruction. Every news report celebrating Ethan's restored hearing simultaneously condemned Grace's methods. Her greatest professional achievement was being systematically reframed as criminal recklessness that threatened public safety. As Grace sat in her jail cell, facing 5 years imprisonment and the loss of her sister's care, She wondered whether restoring Ethan's hearing had been worth destroying both their lives. The grandfather clock that had marked Ethan's first heard sound now counted down days toward a trial that would determine whether medical miracles justified breaking laws designed to protect children from harm. 6 weeks into Grace Rivera's legal nightmare, the truth began emerging through the most unexpected source, 8-year-old Ethan Wellington himself. Despite his family's protective efforts and legal counsel's advice, Ethan insisted on testifying for Grace during the preliminary hearings. The courtroom fell silent as the boy approached the witness stand, his newly restored hearing allowing him to speak with clarity that stunned everyone present. "Grace didn't hurt me," Ethan declared in his clear, young voice that carried throughout the packed courtroom. "She saved me. All those doctors hurt me with their tests and needles, but Grace was gentle. She made me able to hear birds singing just like I painted them." Judge Margaret Patterson allowed Ethan's testimony over prosecution objections, recognizing that the child's perspective was central to determining whether Grace's actions constituted harm or healing. Ethan described years of pain from constant ear scratching, the relief he felt when Grace removed the bad stuff from his ears, and his confusion about why the person who helped him was being punished. "Before Grace, I lived in a white room like in my paintings," Ethan testified with remarkable composure. "Now I can hear Daddy's voice, and it sounds exactly like the golden ribbons I drew. Grace gave me colors I could only imagine before." The emotional impact of Ethan's testimony began shifting courtroom dynamics, but the real breakthrough came when Mark Wellington's private investigators uncovered medical evidence that vindicated Grace's environmental theory. Independent analysis commissioned by the defense confirmed that the debris Grace extracted contained protein compounds that would indeed cause chronic allergic inflammation in ear canals. Dr. Jonathan Morrison from Massachusetts General Hospital reviewed the extracted material and testified that Grace's diagnosis was medically sound. The inflammation patterns are consistent with chronic allergic reactions to synthetic carpet fibers. Dr. Morrison explained, "This condition could easily be mistaken for congenital deafness if environmental factors weren't considered during examination." Laboratory results proved that Ethan's symptoms directly correlated with carpet installation timeline. Medical records showed his hearing problems intensified precisely 6 months before Grace's employment, exactly when Harrison Blake had ordered the expensive Persian-style carpet for Ethan's bedroom. The protein analysis revealed allergen levels sufficient to cause the inflammatory blockages that Grace had successfully removed. Several specialists who had previously condemned Grace's actions began reversing their positions as evidence mounted. Dr. Patricia Coleman from Boston Children's Hospital admitted during cross-examination that environmental assessments had been inadequately performed during Ethan's evaluations. "We focused so intensively on genetic and neurological factors that we may have overlooked obvious environmental contributors," Dr. B. Coleman acknowledged reluctantly. Meanwhile, Mark Wellington's financial forensics team uncovered the devastating truth about Harrison Blake's 20-year deception. Bank records revealed that Harrison had been systematically positioning himself to benefit from Ethan's continued disability through carefully structured inheritance provisions. The butler had secretly maintained accounts containing nearly $2 million accumulated through various schemes involving the Wellington family finances. Documents discovered in Harrison's private quarters revealed the scope of his manipulation. Harrison had deliberately ordered carpet with high allergen content, arranged for regular maintenance that reintroduced inflammatory compounds, and influenced Mark's choice of specialists to avoid environmental assessments. Email correspondence showed Harrison coordinating with certain medical professionals to ensure that simple solutions remained hidden. The most shocking revelation came through carpet installation records that Harrison had attempted to destroy. Witnesses from the flooring company testified that Harrison had specifically requested synthetic fibers with maximum protein content, claiming they were more durable for a special needs child's room. The installer had questioned the choice but deferred to Harrison's authority as family representative. Harrison's financial motive became clear through examination of Mark's will. The document included provisions leaving $100 million to charity if Ethan was declared permanently disabled and unable to inherit Wellington Industries. Harrison had been named executor of charitable distributions, positioning himself to control massive funds if Ethan remained deaf throughout his childhood. Further investigation revealed Harrison's involvement in Catherine Wellington's suicide. Catherine's hidden diary, discovered by Grace months earlier, contained evidence that Harrison had systematically undermined Catherine's maternal confidence while positioning himself as her only confidant. Harrison had provided Catherine with sleeping pills and encouraged her darkest thoughts about being a failed mother. Catherine's final letter, found sewn into her bedroom mattress lining, revealed Harrison's direct role in her death. Harrison says the accident will look natural if I take enough pills first. He promises that Mark and Ethan will be better off without a mother who cannot love a disabled child. Harrison understands my pain when no one else does. The revelation that Catherine's suicide had been encouraged and facilitated by Harrison Blake sent shockwaves through the Wellington family and legal proceedings. Harrison hadn't simply neglected to prevent Catherine's death, he had actively encouraged and assisted her suicide to position himself as indispensable to Mark's grief-stricken household. Grace's past vindication came through independent medical review of her previous patient case. Dr. Robert Chen, chief of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School, led a panel reviewing Emma Martinez's death that had cost Grace her nursing license. The investigation concluded that Emma's death resulted from systemic hospital failures rather than Grace's individual negligence. Nurse Rivera's treatment decisions were appropriate given the information available at the time. Dr. Chen's report stated, "The delayed diagnosis resulted from inadequate physician oversight and institutional communication failures, not nursing malpractice. Nurse Rivera's license should be restored immediately." The medical board's reversal of Grace's license revocation added credibility to her intervention with Ethan. Professional colleagues began testifying about Grace's exceptional diagnostic skills and patient advocacy during her nursing career. Former supervisors described Grace as one of the most dedicated pediatric nurses they had supervised. Public opinion shifted dramatically as Harrison's manipulation became public knowledge. Media narratives changed from vigilante medicine to heroic nurse exposes decades of deception. Grace's supporters organized larger rallies, while former critics acknowledged that the case involved criminal deception rather than medical recklessness. Social media campaigns supporting Grace reached millions of people, with hashtags like #JusticeForGrace and #Harrison trending nationally. Parents shared stories about medical professionals missing obvious diagnoses, while nurses and doctors debated institutional barriers that prevented comprehensive patient assessment. Professional medical organizations began re-evaluating their initial condemnation of Grace's actions. The American Nurses Association issued statements supporting qualified nurses making appropriate interventions in emergency situations. Medical schools began incorporating Grace's case into curricula about environmental factors in pediatric diagnosis. Harrison Blake's arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, accessory to suicide, and attempted murder marked the complete reversal of the case's narrative. The man who had portrayed himself as a loyal family protector was revealed as a calculating criminal who had manipulated family tragedies for personal financial gain. Prosecutors dropped all charges against Grace Rivera within hours of Harrison's arrest. The Connecticut Attorney General issued a public apology acknowledging that Grace's actions had been medically appropriate interventions that exposed criminal manipulation spanning 2 decades. As Grace walked free from the courthouse, Ethan Wellington ran into her arms for the first time since her arrest. The boy's first words were spoken loud enough for gathered reporters to hear clearly. "Thank you for giving me back my sounds. Grace, I never stopped believing in you." 6 months after Grace Rivera's exoneration, the legal system delivered justice with remarkable swiftness. Harrison Blake received a 25-year sentence for fraud, conspiracy, accessory to suicide, and attempted murder. Federal prosecutors successfully argued that Harrison's manipulation of the Wellington family constituted a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had resulted in Catherine's death and years of unnecessary suffering for Ethan. The Connecticut Attorney General's office issued a formal public apology to Grace, acknowledging that her medical intervention had been professionally appropriate and personally heroic. All charges were expunged from her record, and the state provided a $5 million settlement for wrongful prosecution, false imprisonment, and damage to her professional reputation. Legal precedent established by Grace's case created new protections for emergency medical intervention by qualified individuals. The Rivera provision now allows licensed medical professionals to provide emergency care to children when environmental factors suggest simple solutions that established practitioners have overlooked. Mark Wellington personally orchestrated Grace's transformation from housemaid to valued family member. He offered Grace a position as Ethan's private nurse and medical coordinator at an annual salary of $150,000, plus comprehensive benefits and housing for both Grace and her sister Maria within the Wellington Estate's renovated guest wing. Grace's new role involved heading Ethan's ongoing medical care team while coordinating with specialists nationwide. Mark insisted that Grace lead all medical decisions, ensuring that environmental factors would never again be overlooked in his son's health care. Grace's office occupied a suite adjacent to Ethan's bedroom, symbolically replacing the carpet that had caused years of suffering. Maria Rivera's integration into the Wellington household became one of the most heartwarming aspects of the family's transformation. The 16-year-old with Down syndrome blossomed under the estate's supportive environment, attending a progressive special needs program that celebrated her artistic talents and social skills. Maria's room overlooked the garden where she spent hours painting alongside Ethan, their friendship transcending their different abilities. Mark himself underwent profound personal transformation as he learned sign language and rebuilt his relationship with Ethan. Father and son spent hours together exploring Ethan's newly restored hearing, with Mark reading stories aloud while Ethan followed along in sign language. Mark's guilt over years of misguided medical treatments gradually healed through daily demonstrations of Ethan's resilience and forgiveness. Ethan's recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. His hearing developed rapidly through specialized therapy that combined auditory training with his existing visual communication skills. Within 6 months, Ethan was functionally bilingual in spoken English and American Sign Language, serving as a bridge between deaf and hearing communities at his progressive school. The 8-year-old's artistic abilities expanded dramatically as he incorporated auditory experiences into his visual art. His paintings now depicted actual sounds rather than imagined ones, creating stunning synesthetic artwork that museums began requesting for exhibitions. Ethan's story inspired children's books and educational materials about hearing differences and environmental health. Grace's professional redemption came through her restored nursing license and growing reputation as a pediatric environmental specialist. Boston Children's Hospital offered her a consulting position focusing on children with undiagnosed conditions, particularly cases where environmental factors might be overlooked. Grace's combination of clinical expertise and observational skills made her uniquely qualified for complex diagnostic challenges. Her lecture series at Harvard Medical School, titled Environmental Factors in Pediatric Diagnosis Lessons from the Wellington Case, became one of the most popular courses in the curriculum. Grace's teaching emphasized the importance of holistic patient assessment and challenged medical professionals to look beyond expensive tests toward simple environmental solutions. Research opportunities emerged as Grace co-authored groundbreaking studies on environmental causes of childhood hearing problems. Her collaboration with leading specialists produced publications in major medical journals, establishing her as an authority on environmental pediatric health. The Rivera Protocol became standard practice for evaluating hearing problems in children. Mark channeled his business success toward meaningful philanthropy, establishing the Catherine and Ethan Wellington Foundation for Children with Disabilities. The foundation funded research into environmental causes of childhood health problems while providing support for families facing similar challenges. Mark's personal involvement in foundation activities deepened his understanding of disability issues and community needs. The estate's community impact extended far beyond the Wellington family. Local hospitals began implementing environmental assessment protocols inspired by Grace's case. Medical schools revised curricula to emphasize observational skills and environmental factors in diagnosis. The case study became required reading for pediatric residents nationwide. Social change rippled through wealthy communities as families began valuing observational skills over credentials alone. The Wellington case demonstrated that careful attention and genuine care could achieve results that expensive treatments missed entirely. Domestic employees found themselves treated with greater respect and their observations taken more seriously. Legal reforms protected emergency medical intervention while maintaining professional standards. The Rivera provision balanced patient safety with recognition that qualified individuals could provide life-changing care when institutional medicine failed. Medical boards developed guidelines for evaluating unconventional interventions based on outcomes rather than credentials alone. The final scene, 6 months after Harrison's conviction, found the Wellington family gathered in their estate garden for Sunday lunch. Ethan conducted an imaginary orchestra of garden sounds, birds singing, leaves rustling, fountain water bubbling, while Grace and Maria watched with delighted amusement. Mark observed his transformed family with profound gratitude for the housemaid who had changed everything. "Grace," Ethan called out as he finished his musical conducting, "can you hear how the birds sing in B-flat major today?" Grace laughed, her hands moving gracefully in sign language alongside her spoken response. "I hear them perfectly, sweetheart, and they're singing the most beautiful song about second chances." Mark joined their conversation, his own sign language improving daily. "Grace, I spent $50 million trying to buy my son's hearing back, but you gave it to him with $12 worth of supplies and more love than money could ever purchase." Maria contributed her own perspective. Signing enthusiastically, "Ethan taught me that being different isn't being broken. We're both special in our own ways." The mansion's windows stood open wide that afternoon, letting in all the sounds of life that had been silence for too many years. Children's laughter echoed through rooms that had known only whispered medical consultations and desperate hope. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, marking not just time's passage but the restoration of a family that had found healing through an unlikely angel who worked for $12 an hour and possessed the courage to challenge a world of expensive assumptions. As the sun set over the Wellington estate, the sound of genuine happiness filled every corner of the house, a melody that no specialist had been able to prescribe, but that love, observation, and determination had written perfectly. The Wellington family's transformation teaches us that the most profound solutions often come from unexpected sources. Mark Wellington learned that $50 million in specialist fees couldn't match the value of one person's genuine observation and courage. Grace Rivera discovered that her greatest professional failure prepared her for her most important success. Their story reveals how true family transcends blood relations and social boundaries. Grace and Maria found belonging in a mansion that wealth alone had never made into a home. Ethan gained not just his hearing, but a family that valued his worth beyond any disability. Mark discovered that gratitude must be earned through recognizing the gifts that humble hearts bring into our lives. The deeper lesson lies in recognizing that society often dismisses wisdom based on credentials rather than character. Grace's medical expertise mattered less than her willingness to truly see Ethan's struggle. Harrison's 20 years of loyal service masked a heart consumed by greed and manipulation. Sometimes the most qualified person to help us isn't the one with the most degrees, but the one who cares enough to notice what others miss. True healing comes through connections built on trust, observation, and love that sees beyond surface appearances. Have you ever been wrongly accused or dismissed like Grace Rivera, only to later be vindicated when the truth finally emerged?